Welcome to Chapter 8, The Business Cycle. The first question we're going to address in this chapter is stable or unstable. Is the economy inherently stable? Is the market economy stable, or is it unstable? And over the next 3 chapters, we're really going to dig into this issue. It's really the classical economics approach versus the Keynesian economics approach. And this is really an unsolved dilemma as to which is right. And it's been going on for over 80 years now. So it's an interesting dilemma that we have in terms of how to approach the economy, Keynesian or classical. And we've gone back and forth depending on who's in the White House and who's in Congress and who has what the popular culture, what the people want at a specific given time. And that does change. But in order to understand all of that and why we choose one or the other, we need to first talk about what they are and how we got to where we are now. So prior to the 1930s, conventional wisdom was that a market-driven economy was inherently stable. So business cycles, the natural ups and downs in the economy, were short. The downs would be short, the ups would be short, and the market seemed to correct itself automatically. This really happened from the end of the Civil War through the 1920s. This seemed to really hold true, that the economy did seem to correct itself with little or no government intervention. And the government didn't really have very much power to intervene really prior to probably 1900. It would have been very difficult at that time for the government to get too involved anyway. There was no need for government intervention. That is, the prevailing view was a policy of laissez-faire. So you may have heard laissez-faire economics. That means just let people do what they want to do. Let the economy figure itself out. A self-regulating economy. The classical economic approach is that the economy will self-adjust to any deviations from the growth trend. So if there's a bubble or a boom, it will self-adjust back down to the growth curve. And if there is a bust, if there's a downturn in the economy, it will self-adjust back to that same growth curve. In this view, wages and prices are flexible. People can change the price of items. If nobody's buying an item, they'll lower the price. If lots of people are buying the item, they'll increase the price. There would be no price floors and no price ceilings. And according to this view, there would also be no restrictions on wages. People could be paid as little or as much as somebody was willing to pay them, and as little or as much as somebody was willing to work for. There would be no limitations placed on wages. If there would be excess goods, they could sell more by lowering prices. They could decrease output and lay off workers if there were excess goods. Laid off workers would then compete for jobs by asking for lower wages. In essence, this is Say's law. I'll talk about Say's law on the next slide. Say's law says that supply creates its own demand. Whatever was produced would be sold. You would just have to lower the price enough. All workers who sought employment would also be hired. Okay, once again, that's important. All workers who wanted a job would get one. This would occur because people would have time to adjust prices and wages downward. We will never know if Say's law does in fact work at this point in our economy, because we have a minimum wage. We can't know if Say's law works because we can't let wages self-adjust themselves down. Now, the thought is, the classical economic thought is that for some people, very low-skilled workers, yes, they may have to settle for the very low-paying jobs to start. Not always, to start, at which point they would get experience, they would get seniority, and they could work their way quickly up the pay scale as they became more in demand. But there would need to be that very low pay at the beginning when people are young, you're 16, just entering the workforce, part-time job, that you would have that low wage while you gained experience and skills. We won't know if that happens because of the minimum wage. There are fewer jobs. Once again, minimum wage creates a price floor, and a price floor creates a surplus. So minimum wage does create unemployment. There aren't as many jobs because were forced to pay a certain wage. So we won't know if Say's law does in fact work in a modern economy. But I wanted to give you the plus and minus there. I wanted to give you both sides of that issue with Say's law. Macro failure. The self-adjustment mechanism did not work during the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes analyzed the situation during the Great Depression and concluded that self-adjustment cannot occur because of an insufficiency of effective demand. He asserted that a market-driven economy was in fact inherently unstable. He concluded that the government must intervene by increasing aggregate demand. When we say aggregate demand, what we mean is cumulative demand, total demand, the demand of everyone in an economy. So the economists love that term, aggregate demand, or AD, which is what we'll call it from now on. AD is just simply the demand for all goods and services of all citizens and businesses. That's a way to look at it. So a few issues with this slide, and this is where I may differ from the book a little bit, and I wanted to take a minute and address this. The self-adjustment mechanism never really had a chance to work in the Great Depression because as soon as you assert government regulation at any level, then true market correction is limited. The market can only correct because it's limited by government laws, policies, taxes, all of these things. So the more regulation you have, the harder it is for the market to self-regulate. It will still self-regulate, but only within the parameters given to it by the government. Well, the Great Depression was an exercise in deflation. So what happened was when consumers stopped spending, and they stopped spending for numerous reasons, which we don't really have time to get into here. When consumers stopped spending, businesses couldn't survive because no one was buying their products, and then the people who worked for those businesses lost their jobs, and then they couldn't spend, and the businesses that they used to shop at couldn't survive, and they let their people go, and so those employees couldn't spend, and it just started to snowball into a deflationary cycle. And Keynes didn't believe the economy could work its way out of that. Well, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, agreed with Keynes, and he decided to run on a platform in 1932 to get elected president that he was going to do whatever it took to fix the Great Depression. If he tried something and it failed, he'd try something else. So Roosevelt started playing with the economy in 32 and using massive government programs and government intervention into all aspects of the economy to try and fix the economy. The reality was he didn't fix it. He was elected in 32, took office in early 33, and we didn't really exit the Great Depression until after we jumped into World War II, and we didn't even start to see a substantial improvement until 42 when we were already in the war, 42, 43. So you're looking at 9 or 10 years and the start of World War II, which really got us out of the Great Depression. But you're looking at 9 or 10 years of failed government policy to try and fix the Great Depression. It didn't work. For some reason, over time, history has gotten distorted a little bit in terms of exactly what happened there. We look at FDR as a hero of the Great Depression. He gave the people hope. People liked to rally around him, but he certainly didn't fix the situation. He didn't stop the deflationary cycle. He didn't fix unemployment. Unemployment stayed extremely high up until the start of World War II. So there's no evidence to support that he fixed the Great Depression with Keynesian economics, but we often hear that that's what happened. Government intervention. For an underperforming economy, Keynes proposed that the government intervene. The government should buy more output, B-U-Y, not B-Y, sorry for the typo, employ more people. The government should do hiring. They should provide more income transfers. That income transfers would be unemployment. It's welfare, Social Security, Medicare. These are modern income transfers. These didn't all exist back then. Food stamps. Income transfer is taking money from those who have it and giving it to people who don't. And the purpose of that is that taking the money that the rich wouldn't be spending and give it to the poor so they can spend it, thereby increasing aggregate demand. In essence, you're making more money available for spending. For an overheated economy that's going too fast, Keynes proposed higher taxes, spending reductions, and reduced availability of money. And what's interesting right now is even though we have in 2013 a very Keynesian approach to the economy, we still increase taxes, which is something we, according to Keynes, we should not have done when we did that in early 2013. The business cycle. The business cycle is a series of peaks and troughs with a growth trend that goes through it. Something to think about, and once again, the step away from the intention of the book and the PowerPoint slide here. The peak and the trough in this particular slide, I would look at as a market economy. Fairly big ups and downs. So in a market economy, you're going to have deeper troughs and higher peaks, and you're going to have, at the end of the day, a higher growth trend. In a Keynesian approach, or a more socialist economy, a more government-controlled economy, you're going to have a slightly lower growth trend, and you're going to have peaks and troughs on that orange line, but they're going to be muted. They're going to be much smaller. And this goes back to how most people approach economics personally. So if somebody is risk averse, they don't like risk, they don't like big ups and downs, they like things very consistent, they're going to tend to be Keynesian, where the government is going to mute the peaks and the troughs and lower the growth trend, but you don't have those deep troughs, which really scare some people. The more risk-averse person will tend to be more classical in their approach, and they'll take the troughs because of the peaks, and at the end of the day, the overall higher growth trend. So something to consider. Terms associated with the business cycle: economic growth. You have economic growth anytime you grow faster than 3%, the GDP. We're almost always going to have economic growth at this point in time. That's mainly because we inflate the money supply by so much that growth will just follow the money supply. And we increase government spending so much that that also increases the GDP. So 3% is actually pretty low considering the government intervention in the economy right now to be considered growth. Growth recession, this is what's happening right now in 2013. Real GDP grows, but it's slower than 3%. Recession, 2 or more consecutive quarters with negative GDP. And depression is a long period of recession. Model of the macroeconomy, macro outcomes. Output is real GDP, jobs, unemployment or employment, prices, CPI, and inflation. We've already talked about all of these terms in other chapters so far. Growth, year-to-year expansion of GDP, and international balances, value of the dollar, and trade balances. These are just more definitions. And how the macroeconomy, these are the macro outcomes. And once again, we've already talked about all of these. Additional determinants of macro performance. International market forces, so things that, internal market forces. So when our population grows, when spending increases or decreases, when something new is invented or something is innovated, that typically will create additional GDP and more growth. External shocks, so when we go to war, an event like 9/11, trade disruptions by something that happens in another country, these can definitely have a negative impact on our economy. And policy levers, when we raise or lower taxes, government spending, changes in the availability of money, regulations, new regulations, this affects the economy as well. For example, with tax policy, when Reagan came into office, he lowered the top tax bracket from over 70% to 29%, if memory serves. And that 40+% drop in taxes gave us a tremendous boom. So economically, so the economy responded to tax policy. And we see that with we could talk about examples all day for policy levers, but we'll just leave it with that one. The controversy is whether policy levers are effective and necessary. Keynes said yes, classical economists said no, that they are not necessary. Also controversial is whether pure market-driven economies are inherently stable or unstable. Keynes says unstable, classical economists say stable. This is extremely important. This is the essence of the debate on how to approach the economy. If we were to take this into politics, Democrats have historically been Keynesian in their approach to economics. And if we're being honest, Republicans really took a more Keynesian approach at the end of the Reagan presidency, starting with George Bush 1. He also was a little bit more Keynesian than historically the Republicans have been. Classical economists, there is a growing trend to return to more of a classical approach in politics right now. But both parties at their core have really had more of a Keynesian approach for the last 20 years or so. Once again, the classical voices are starting to be a little bit louder these days. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Aggregate demand and supply and aggregate supply. The forces of supply and demand are at work in the macroeconomy. Any influence on macro outcomes must be transmitted through supply or demand. The macro model shows how the macroeconomy works, and it consists of aggregate supply, AS, and aggregate demand, or AD, as we will talk about it. So how the economy essentially works is total demand and total supply. Now we're going to look at that. AD is the total quantity of output, real GDP, demanded at alternative price levels in a given time period. It's the collective behavior of everyone. It's what we all buy. Aggregate supply is the total output that we are willing to sell. So it's the total amount of output in terms of services and products that an economy produces. Short-run instability, competing theories. Classical economists believe the economy will self-regulate and gravitate towards full employment. Keynes and his followers do not believe this. They believe the economy might get worse without government intervention. It's an interesting dilemma because the Keynesians are so afraid of a trough being never-ending. Of course, the reality is no trough has ever been never-ending. The economy always rebounds. The human spirit, especially the American spirit, is one of forward-thinking, innovation, invention, entrepreneurship, increasing income, increasing standard of living. The people, and this really is a worldwide trait, one of open economies or of non-communist countries, people want to push forward and are allowed to push forward to some degree and want better lives for them and their families. And that drives the economy. Keynes doesn't believe that this is enough. Classical economists do believe that this is enough and believe that the power of the individual will always supersede what the government can do by stepping in. Keynesian theory, this is a demand side theory. Recession originates with deficiency of spending. We already talked about that at the beginning, the deflationary spiral. And inflation originates with excess in spending, as opposed to an excess of money in the system. And so once again, the book then relates this to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. There are great graphs in the book, and I highly recommend you go take a look at those to get a better picture of how all this works. Monetary theory. This is a demand side theory emphasizing the role of money in financing aggregate demand. Tight money causes demand to shift to the left or decrease. So the less money there is in the system, or the less new money there is in the system, the less demand there will be. And easy money, which we have now, where we're increasing our money supply by leaps and bounds, that will drive the economy forward and shift aggregate demand to the right. Of course, raising the money supply is also going to raise prices because there's going to be more money. It's going to shift demand to the right, and when demand shifts to the right, prices go up. So by increasing the money supply, we always risk high inflation. Long-run self-adjustment. Advocates argue that short-run instability is not as important as the long-run trend. This relies heavily on the theory that the economy will self-adjust. The long run, historically, the long run results favor heavily the classical economic approach, that in the long run the economy has always worked itself out. Governments come and go, but the economy will continue to push forward, once again, from the human spirit wanting to push innovation and get personal wealth. That drive has always pushed the economy forward. In the short run, and we live in the short run, it's hard to be patient. Knowing that things will be great in 10 or 15 years doesn't help people tomorrow. So this is where the people often ask the government to step in and fix things. They want the government to come in and solve all their problems right away. And this is a little bit dangerous, especially with our political cycles. Our politicians are elected on very short terms, 2, 4, 6 years, and they want to fix everything within their term so they can get reelected. If they had a long-term approach, then the odds on re-election go down because things may get worse before they get better. And so out of their own desire to keep their jobs, politicians traditionally have maintained a very short-run approach to the economy. And there's a large debate right now as to whether our current situation with term limits and or lack thereof are actually hurting our economy. And read an article recently talking about how getting rid of all, or imposing term limits in Congress, and limiting the president to one term, limiting congressmen and senators to 1 4-year term, they would be more likely to have a long-term and healthier economic policy mentality because they know that they're not going to have that job anyway, so they're not always looking at re-election. So there's a growing movement that way to get a healthier long-term perspective on the economy rather than always making short-term fixes which end up hurting us in the long run. And there's a lot more that we can discuss there. I'll cut it off right there because I don't want to drag this on any longer. We'll see you again in Chapter 9.